Both wish to offer any rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. If you call your next witness, please.
Commonwealth will call Dr. Avram Mack.
Good morning. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony and the evidence you shall give to the court and the jury will not be between you and shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you. You may proceed, sir.
All right. Good morning, Doctor.
Morning.
All right. I just ask you to keep your voice up so the jury can hear you. And with that, Attorney Buckingham, please.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please tell the jurors your first and last name?
Avram Mack.
And would you spell your name for the record, please?
Avram is spelled A, V like Victor, R like Robert, A like Apple, M like Mary.
And I'm just going to ask you to speak in a loud, clear voice. And if you need to kind of push closer to the microphone, that might help.
I will.
Thank you. What do you do for work, sir?
I'm a psychiatrist.
And how long have you been a psychiatrist?
After training, I've been a psychiatrist for 22 years now.
And can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
Sure. I went to the University of Michigan College, Cornell University for medical school. I was here at the Brigham for residency in psychiatry. And then that was followed by a fellowship in child psychiatry at Columbia University and a one-year fellowship in forensic psychiatry at New York University.
And what do you do now? What's your area of practice now?
I'm a psychiatrist. For all these 22 years, I've been serving in a lot of different roles. Currently, I'm a professor of psychiatry at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and I see patients at a child hospital called Nemours.
And so you, in your current practice, have a clinical practice, and you also do forensic psychiatry. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And do you have any board certifications?
I do.
And what are you board certified in?
I'm board certified in psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and also forensic psychiatry. I had been board certified in addiction medicine by the American Board of Addiction Medicine, but they closed. So I don't know if I can still say that I'm board certified by them.
Okay. And to what extent are you engaged in the forensic psychiatry? What areas of forensic psychiatry do you have you testified in?
I've provided testimony in perhaps almost every area of forensic psychiatry, ranging from testamentary capacity of adults who engage in contracts or appropriateness for adoption, or whether or not a person is competent, or if a person is criminally responsible.
Now, in what areas of the country have you testified on those topics?
Around the country. I'm not sure how many states I've testified in, but I've been engaged in reviews or investigations of cases in, I think, more than half the states.
And what does it mean to conduct a forensic evaluation in psychiatry?
Well, it can mean a lot of different things depending on the question that's being asked by a court or other authority. Sometimes there are statutes that you as the forensic psychiatrist need to try to answer a particular question that a statute requires. Or sometimes it is a matter of giving an opinion, say in a civil case, where it's your understanding of, say, the degree of harm that the person has experienced. Sometimes great, sometimes not so great.
And you, in your experience, have testified as a forensic psychiatrist in both civil and criminal matters, correct?
Correct.
And are you aware of a difference between forensic psychiatry versus forensic psychology?
There are differences, aside from the fact that they're different professions, but they both cover mental health. There are different rules that apply to forensic psychologists in their carrying out their roles as psychologists.
Now, when you mentioned that you have done some work and testified in matters regarding criminal responsibility, right?
Correct.
And you're aware that different states have slightly different statutes when it comes to criminal responsibility.
Yes.
And so in this case, you were asked to review the matter of the Commonwealth versus Lindsay Clancy, correct?
Yes.
And so in order to do that, did you review the statutes here in Massachusetts regarding criminal responsibility?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell us how it came that you were involved in this case?
I was asked by the prosecutor's office to be involved as a psychiatrist reviewing the matter.
And when you're asked or you're retained by either side in a case, defense or prosecution, what is the goal of the evaluation? Are you just trying to advocate for the side who hires you, or are you conducting an independent evaluation of the evidence?
Overall.
You can answer.
Well, to answer your question, certainly the goal is to provide an independent evaluation, or one would also add to provide clarity and to say what can be said. In criminal matters, sometimes it's a very certain question that it's either a yes or a no. In other matters, it's not always necessarily a strict yes or no.
Now, in criminal matters where you were asked to conduct these independent evaluations, how do you approach it? What kind of information do you seek, or would you prefer to have in order to conduct the evaluation?
Well, generally one starts with the statute and then tries to gather or review what information exists to understand the mental state of the person, if that's pertaining to the particular statutory question, and to understand the mental history and the mental state of the individual, and to see if that can be applied to the questions at hand.
And so what types of records are you generally looking at when conducting a forensic evaluation for something like criminal responsibility?
Well, one would certainly want to review psychiatric records if they exist. Ideally also to have examined the individual and to gather information, not only historical information from the individual, but to do, in that sense, an examination in real time. And that provides you the information, what we call a mental status examination.
Okay.
Other records are also important: medical records, educational records, and other records that describe the individual.
And when we're talking about a criminal case, fair to say you review the entire criminal file too, right?
Yes.
And when you're doing these evaluations and creating a database of this particular information, are there any limitations to your opinion or evaluation?
I'm not sure how you mean that.
Well, when you have these evaluations that you're conducting, namely for criminal responsibility, do those evaluations, are they limited based on the information that you have? Meaning, if you don't have everything at the time you do your evaluation, is there kind of a caveat to your opinion?
Well, when I write an opinion or state an opinion, it is based on the totality of the information that I have. If additional information comes along, I am open to receiving that and integrating that into my understanding of the totality.
Now, when you interview the individual in these evaluations, the purpose of the interview or purpose of your contact with them is not to provide treatment, correct?
Correct.
And the opinion that you reach ultimately is based on the defendant's mental state, correct?
To the extent that impacts the question, yes.
Okay. Well, when we're talking about criminal responsibility, you'd agree that's the kind of the central issue, is the person's mental state at the time of the alleged offense, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So in Massachusetts here, with the question of criminal responsibility, are you aware of what the standard is?
Yes.
And what is it?
Well, it uses particular language based on the common concept throughout the country called the McNaughton standard. And I could read to you the specifics of the language, but effectively it refers to two pieces. Well, actually starts with three. One is, did the person have a mental disorder at the time of the event? And then secondly, the two prongs speak to specifics about the mental state at the time. One being, and I would want to refer to the actual statute.
Well, if we can, maybe we break that down for the jury.
Yeah.
So the first part of this for criminal responsibility is the question of, does the person suffer from a mental disease or defect, correct?
Correct.
Objection to the leading. Let's see if he knows.
Yeah, if you just ask him.
I can rephrase
He's
the
aware, and
question.
if you want to refresh his memory, you can.
Well, you've already testified the first part of the analysis, and I think you used the terminology mental disorder.
Yes, I did.
And you're aware that a mental disorder is a clinical term.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. I apologize. What was that?
A mental disorder is a clinical term. The terminology mental disease or defect, are you aware that's a legal term?
Okay.
Okay. Well, so when you were conducting evaluations for criminal responsibility,
Is that an answer?
Yes.
Said,
I'm
okay.
sorry. Yes.
Yeah, all right.
when you're conducting an evaluation for criminal responsibility and you're trying to determine whether a person suffers from a mental disease or defect, do you look to mental disorders to see if that meets criteria?
I would evaluate if the person has ever had a psychiatric or a mental disorder.
And what kinds of tools do you have available to you to do that?
Well, there are two tools. One is gathering of historical information, and the other is the information you gather from actually seeing the person face to face.
And as a psychiatrist, that's something you do in your clinical practice all the time, right?
Correct.
Because one of the main things you're going to do is look to try to diagnose an individual.
Correct.
And so how do you go about determining that if a person has a mental disorder?
In psychiatry, we make diagnoses in a descriptive manner. We look to see ways in which the individual has symptoms or signs of mental disorders or mental defects or psychiatric disorders. So in particular, one will start with trying to gather as much information as possible about what are the things that bother the individual. That may be their mood, that might be things that they get anxious about, that may be abnormal movements that they make. And that will also be aligned with understanding their medical condition, any medications that they take, any substances that they use. There's an array of information, sets of information that one gathers in that portion where you ask questions. But effectively, you're asking questions about symptoms. And one is trying to understand not just symptoms, but the degree of impairment that symptoms might be causing an individual.
And do you work with any sort of tools that help you identify particular characteristics of symptoms associated with disorders in your field?
Well, at times, individuals use scales or tests, which can be psychological tests or scales that ask particular questions. Or other times, you might use tests that are biological tests, like the person's brain waves, called an EEG, or laboratory tests.
When you're talking about diagnosing an individual for any particular mental disorder, are there specific criteria for different types of disorders?
Yes, there are.
And is there a source that you use as a psychiatrist in order to identify the criteria for different disorders?
We use a text called the DSM, otherwise known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's currently in its 5th edition, or actually a revision was made of its 5th edition. And so that text, which is created and vetted by a large number of professionals, provides criteria for the different disorders, and these are known as operational criteria. In psychiatry, there aren't necessarily gold standards that you can use for diagnosis, like finding a bacterium or finding an anatomical tissue. So for the last 60 years, 70 years, psychiatry has turned to agreed upon definitions that are listed in the DSM.
Okay. And you said it's not the end-all be-all, right, of diagnosing. You use your training and experience as well. but it's a tool that you use.
Well, it is they are the criteria that one uses to make the diagnosis. It is not a guidebook for how to gather that information. It's not a how-to, but it is the standard.
Okay. So now going back to the legal standard here in Massachusetts, so one part is the disorder, right? And you said there's a second part.
Right, so the second part are particular criteria about the person's state at the time of the event. So one of them is they both utilize the verb to have retained, retained substantial capacity to know that the act was wrong or against the law, and the other being retained substantial capacity to control or conform one's behaviors to the law.
And so when you're talking about criminal responsibility here in Massachusetts, is it fair to say you're looking at the person's conduct and their condition at the time of the offense?
That's right.
And the information that you're gathering in this overall evaluation, getting history and kind of looking at the person as a whole, is that helpful to understand the person's diagnosis when you're being asked this particular question?
Yes.
But ultimately, you're rendering an opinion of the person at the time of the offense.
That's correct.
So in this particular case, you were provided a series of records and information regarding the defendant, Lindsay Clancy, correct?
Yes.
And can you just give us a general overview of the sources of information you had available to you?
Generally speaking, there was the criminal file, as you mentioned before. And then in terms of medical or psychiatric records, there was the records from the hospital that she's at right now, the hospital that she was at right before, called Spalding, the hospital that she was at before that, which was Brigham and Women's. In addition, there was the medical records from outpatient treaters, and there was also the records from her admission to McLean Hospital. So overall, there were outpatient records, there were inpatient records. For the most part, those all correlated with her own care. Additionally, we received the pediatric records for some of the victims in this matter. And as I mentioned before, the criminal file.
Okay. And in addition to the records related to the defendant herself, we also provided some other reports to review.
I was.
By other psychiatrists and psychologists?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that one of the things that's useful in these evaluations is an interview with the person themselves, right?
Yes.
And did you engage in an interview with the defendant?
I did.
And when did that occur?
I interviewed her on April 10th and April 12th of this year.
And that's of this year in 2026?
Correct.
And what were your observations of her when you first met with her on April 10th? Can you describe her demeanor?
Generally, she was friendly and cooperative.
When you begin an interview with an individual that you're evaluating, do you conduct what's referred to as a mental status exam?
Well, the mental status exam happens all the while that you're interacting with somebody. You're always observing for aspects of their emotions, how they speak, their mood, and so forth. Sometimes there are directed aspects of the mental status examination where you are asking about particular cognitive capacities like executive functioning and attention and concentration. But the gathering of information about the person's mood, for example, or their thought process, that happens throughout the entire portion.
Okay, and so over the course of the time that you met with the defendant, were you able to make observations of, for instance, whether she maintained eye contact with you when speaking?
Right, so she did maintain eye contact.
Okay. What about her emotional state?
So overall, if we go through the various components, like what's called her affect, which is her emotional expression or her mood, generally speaking, there were not many abnormalities in her presentation, and I can go through them. They include the way in which she speaks, that is to say the rapidity of speech, if the speech is made in sort of regular intervals between words. In terms of thought, does the person, and in this case did Ms. Clancy, make goal-directed ideas? Was there a particular content of the ideas? So generally speaking, for all the components of the mental status examination, there were not really abnormalities. I would say at some points she seemed distressed by some topics. I believe tearful at one point, but otherwise nothing remarkable on mental status examination.
Okay. And in these evaluations, when you're interviewing the individuals, are you also kind of taking account of their physical presentation?
Yes.
And obviously, when you met with her in April of 2026, you were able to observe her physical condition, right?
Yes.
And what were your observations of her physical condition?
Well, she's utilizing a wheelchair. Generally speaking, there were not necessarily abnormal movements that I observed. She seemed comfortable physically.
Did you find that she was able to kind of navigate her situation herself? Meaning you were in a room with her with other individuals, right?
Yes.
And she was able to kind of take care of her own.
I'm going to object leading at this point, just as they object.
Sustained, if you just ask the observations.
What did you observe her do as far as moving herself around the room? Was she able to do that?
Yes, at the moments when there were transitions, when we took a break and she went out to the hall, she was able to navigate her wheelchair one place or another.
And when you spoke with her on April 10th and April 12th, were you able to kind of have a conversation with her about her level of functioning at the Tewksbury?
Yes.
And did she tell you anything about what her general day looked like?
She described her general day. She described basically her existence there at Tewksbury.
Okay. And did she indicate to you whether she engaged with other patients, or did she spend her day mostly in bed, or what did she say about that?
Mostly she described she stays in bed or on her own. I don't think she described interacting with patients very much. There were a couple of ways in which she did interact with staff, at least. There was a therapist that she described working with. She did describe having had a physical therapist at a certain point. I'm not sure if I remember if she still was getting physical therapy. She stated she wasn't very interested in the physical therapy that she was getting there. She wasn't interested in the food there. She described having visitors at a not infrequent basis, and that sometimes she was able to eat food or drinks that were brought in by them.
And who were her visitors, if you recall?
Family members mostly, as well as, I believe, both, and I'm not sure if they were specifically from the Brigham or Mass General, but or any place in particular, but I believe religious figures, chaplain or priest from some organizations.
And her having told you that she kind of has visitors, were you able to corroborate that in reviewing records that she had visitors?
Yes.
And were you able to corroborate, or were you able to identify in the records that she did interact with staff and patients at the hospital, according to the records?
To some degree, yes.
And you said that she had indicated to you that the food wasn't appealing at the hospital. And did you have the chance to observe her consuming her own snacks or beverages?
Beverages, yes.
Now, did she indicate to you her level of attention to hygiene and grooming while at Tewksbury?
She did. She described that she wasn't very interested in her own hygiene or grooming.
And were you able to later in the conversation speak with her about her ability to take care of her own daily activities like grooming? For instance, showering. Was she able to do that on her own?
Showering is embarrassing. It requires staff to help her, and that's one way in which she would rather not. It may also be that she described a lack of interest, so it's both components.
When you observed her, did she appear to be disheveled or not properly groomed in your meetings on April 10th and 12th?
No, she appeared groomed sufficiently, and I believe her hair was combed and she was wearing neat clothing.
Now, did she describe to you her thoughts or feelings about her current situation?
Yes.
And what did she say about that?
Well, she described feeling depressed, which she termed situational depression. She described feeling, I'm not sure the exact term she used, but feeling miserable, not wanting to be alive.
And
Let him finish, please. If he's finished, that's fine, but don't cut him off.
All right, yeah, that's all right.
I'm sorry, doctor, were you done?
Yes.
Thank you. So when you were meeting with her, do you recall her indicating that she reported being devastated,
Yes.
that she was devastated and grieving by her current situation?
Yes.
When you met with her at the Tewksbury Hospital, did you go over with her what her current treatment regimen is, what current medication she was on?
I did.
Was she able to tell you what medication she was taking?
Yes.
And were you able to confirm that with the records, that that was an accurate report?
Yes.
So what medications, when you met with her in April 2026, was she currently on?
Well, in terms of psychiatric medications, the main medication of note is olanzapine. I believe that there were several medications being used for her physical needs. One that helps with her bladder, one that helps with movement of the GI system.
Well, let's just kind of focus on the psychiatric medications, right? Because that's of your interest here. You mentioned olanzapine. What's the common or the brand name for that?
It's called Zyprexa.
And what is it used to treat?
Originally, it was created to be an antipsychotic medication, so to treat psychosis.
Okay. And are you aware that it's prescribed to Ms. Clancy for bipolar?
Yes, it is also used for mania. It is also sometimes used.
Responses, the question was bipolar.
Yeah, yeah. The question. If you could just listen to the question, and then if the Commonwealth or the other side wants to add to the answer, they'll ask you. Okay, go ahead.
So I think my question was, are you aware that the Zyprexa is prescribed for bipolar?
So bipolar is a disorder. Yes, bipolar is a disorder of mania. Which is, I'm sorry, why I was mentioning at that point.
And what was the dosage of the Zyprexa that she was on, if you recall?
I believe it was 2.5 milligrams.
And in your experience, is that a significant dosage?
No, it's a small dose.
Are you aware of any other psychiatric medications that she's prescribed at Tewksbury?
I believe she's also taking trazodone.
Okay. How about Wellbutrin? Is that ring a bell?
Yes, Wellbutrin is an antidepressant medication.
Okay. And clonidine, does that sound familiar?
Yes, clonidine is a medication that's sometimes used for anxiety or to help people go to sleep.
And are you familiar with the propranolol?
Propranolol is also a medication. It also is sometimes used to help with anxiety.
Okay. And as far as the dosage of medication that she's on, based on your review of the records, are those high doses, low doses?
Overall, they're on the lower side of dosages.
And you indicated briefly in your testimony that she had reported to you that she believes to have situational depression.
Yes.
Did you have a conversation with her about the diagnosis from Tewksbury?
There were times that if you're asking about bipolar disorder, At one point, she made the statement that she wasn't convinced that she has bipolar or has had bipolar disorder. She described situational depression in terms of feeling depressed about the several stressors that she experiences today.
And what are those stressors?
Well, the remorse and sadness about the events that this case is about, her separation or estrangement from her then husband, her being separated from the world, her physical injury.
Do you recall her actually using the term remorse, or is that just your description of the conversation you had?
That's my summarization right here.
Okay. Now, when you were meeting with her, did you talk to her about past medication regimens that she had been on prior to the current regimen of the Zyprexa and Wellbutrin?
Yes.
And so are you aware that she had previously been prescribed at some point lithium?
Yes.
And is that something that would be important to you to know when you were conducting your own evaluation for diagnosis of whether somebody was on lithium?
It might help, but in psychiatry, we don't make diagnoses based on medication response.
And when it came to the report of the lithium, fair to say it was not something that was trialed for a very long period of time.
Yes, and let me correct that. It's not that we don't make diagnoses. We don't categorize or define disorders by medication response. I heard the description of the trial of lithium. That was a short trial.
Okay. And about her physical injuries, did you have a conversation with her about her understanding of her physical injuries?
Yes.
Do you recall whether she reported that she had any head injuries after January 24th?
She denied that she had had a head injury.
And was she familiar with the extent of her spinal injury?
Yes.
Meaning she was able to explain to you where the injuries occurred? And
that's correct.
were you able to review in your interview with her past psychiatric history?
Yes.
And did she have a significant past psychiatric history?
Prior to the year 2022, she had not. She had been, over time, very hard driving, someone who tended to get anxious, and anxiety sometimes pushed her to achieve or to do things. There had been two short periods of depression or anxiety throughout her lifetime. In one, she had been prescribed antidepressant medication around 2 years before 2022, which she had not actually taken. She had tended to resolve her anxiety or depression through exercise and hard work.
And when you say the two short periods, are you speaking of periods after childbirth?
One was while she was in nursing school, and the other was after the birth of her second child.
So you were able to have the conversation with her about nursing school and going on medications during that experience, right?
Yes.
And as far as the second episode where she described anxiousness and seeking medication, did she indicate to you whether she actually took medication?
No,
after the birth?
Sorry.
After the birth of her second child?
She had been prescribed it, but she hadn't taken it.
Now, based on your review of records and your interview with her, were you able to identify and learn some general information about her family history?
Yes.
Did she report anyone in her family suffering from any other mental illness in the past?
No.
So no history of bipolar disorder or prior depression?
Correct. No such history.
Did you also review with her her work history?
Yes.
And did you talk to her about whether there were any adverse events in her past that affected her?
That is something I asked about. And also I was able to look at her records to try to elicit if there were any particular adverse events in her life.
Did you find any evidence of any? And you said that prior to 2022, there hadn't been, or there was minimal psychiatric history, did you look at and talk to her about the period of 2022 from approximately September leading up to the events of January 24th, 2023?
Yes, I did.
So as far as going through that time period, you were able to review her medication history during that time?
Yes.
And fair to say there was a significant amount of medications that you looked at as far
Yes.
as what she was taking and what it was prescribed for?
Correct.
Did anything stand out to you in the timeline of her medication history that was significant in this case?
Well, she was initially prescribed medication in September of 2022. She didn't actually start taking that medication, sertraline, until October. There were several different medications that were prescribed. It is not clear that she actually took every medication that was ever prescribed or that she necessarily took it more than 1 or 2 times. There was a period of trial on a second antidepressant called Prozac. There were various medications used to help her to sleep. And then there was a several-week period of taking a medication called Seroquel or quetiapine.
Are you familiar with that medication in your practice?
I am.
And is it fair to say that that medication has multiple functions, like most psychiatric medications? When you reviewed her history, what was the initial dose that she was prescribed for it?
Just 25 milligrams.
And what is a 25 milligram dose of Seroquel? What is that generally prescribed for?
Well, it's often prescribed these days to help individuals to sleep. But Seroquel is also, like Zyprexa, a antipsychotic medication. It can be used to help people to sleep. It can be used to help psychosis. It can be used to help the treatment of depression.
Okay. And as far as your review of the medication timeline for this defendant with the Seroquel, would the amount of time that she took the Seroquel have had any lasting effects biologically on her brain or her body?
There's no known effect that one would have from the amount of time that she took it. There could have been temporary effects, which could have been affecting her functioning or her psychological reaction to her functioning. But there's no known biological long-term effect.
So when you say that they could have some effect, are we talking about symptoms or negative symptoms maybe?
So Seroquel might affect a person's ability to think straight. We talked earlier about cognition, the ability to pay attention, to concentrate, to have memory. And Seroquel can negatively affect your cognitive functioning, although it is expected that that will eventually go away when you stop taking the medication.
And is Seroquel a type of medication that lingers in a person's system?
Not substantially. There are some medications that do linger, like diazepam or Valium, which is another medication that she was later prescribed. All medications are, on a relative basis. So diazepam will stay in your body much longer than, say, lorazepam, a different benzodiazepine.
Okay, but as far as the Seroquel goes, once a person stops taking it, is it fair to say that the symptoms or any negative symptoms that they have would eventually resolve themselves?
Yes.
And you're aware of the medications, the last reported medications that the defendant was on right before the events of January 24th?
I am.
And what were those?
Melatonin, lorazepam, trazodone, and an antidepressant medication called amitriptyline.
And as far as the amitriptyline, you're aware of what the dosage was?
Well, on the day before January 24th, it became 20 milligrams, but for several days before that, it was 10 milligrams.
Now, in your experience, a 10 milligram to 20 milligram dose of amitriptyline, is that a significant dosage?
It's small. The usual starting dose for an adult is 150 milligrams.
Are you aware of what the chief complaints or problems that the defendant had been reporting at the time when these medications were all being prescribed to her in 2022?
Well, it's a several-month period, but it started in September of 2022 with complaints of anxiety and depression.
And fair to say, in reviewing all the records and with your conversation, that sleep also was a main issue or a complaint.
Yes, that's right.
And in some of the medications that you reviewed, is sleep, could the medications themselves affect a person's sleep?
Yes, sertraline can.
Now, as far as past diagnosis of this defendant, you were able to review overall in all the records that were available to you what different providers had given as far as past diagnoses, correct?
Yes.
And as far as your overall evaluation in determining criminal responsibility, where you have to answer first that question of mental disease or defect, do you rely on those prior diagnoses or do you come to your own conclusions?
I come to my own conclusions.
Are the fact that there were past diagnoses something that you consider?
Yes, especially to the extent that they highlighted the basis for those prior diagnoses. I don't necessarily have to agree with the diagnoses, but I'm interested in what was observed in terms of coming to those diagnoses.
And when you're doing these types of evaluations for criminal responsibility, why do you not rely on a past diagnosis? Why do you come to your own conclusion?
Well, that's part of being an independent evaluator, where in your mind you're able to collate the information and make your own diagnosis.
As far as kind of before we move on to your actual diagnosis, in addition to the interview that you had with the defendant over those 2 days, reviewing all the records, did you attempt to speak with what are called collaterals?
I did not.
Is that something that you sometimes do in these evaluations?
Sometimes.
Fair to say, in this particular case, you did have a significant amount of information from people that were close to the defendant, right?
That was my view, yes.
And after speaking with the defendant, did she identify to you some people that maybe you could talk to?
I don't remember who she said, but I think she suggested perhaps her husband or then husband.
But you yourself didn't have an interview with Patrick Clancy, did you?
No.
But you were able to review his grand jury testimony and interviews he's given with the police in the past, right?
Yes, I did. And CPS.
And as far as speaking with the defendant's parents or her sister, are you aware that attempts were made or requests were made to speak with them, but they didn't respond?
I wasn't aware of that. I was not.
So based on everything that you reviewed in this case, were you able to come to a conclusion about diagnosis?
Yes, I did.
And at the time that you conducted this evaluation, what is your opinion about diagnosis?
My opinion about her diagnosis in the span from 2022 to 2023 is that she suffered from what's called a major depressive episode. That probably is a part of what's called a major depressive disorder, but the important point about it is the major depressive episode.
What made you come to that conclusion based on her presentations?
The information about her feelings and the progression of her illness highlighted that it was best represented by a major depressive episode. It's a condition defined in DSM-5 where an individual displays problems with mood, problems with feeling pleasure, feelings of guilt or worthlessness, problems with appetite, problems with sleep, preoccupation with death or suicide, poor concentration, poor energy, perhaps also what's called psychomotor agitation or retardation. So one doesn't necessarily need to show all of those, but as it is in the DSM criteria sets, one needs to have a certain threshold, and her history and her description of her experience, in my view, matched a major depressive episode.
Okay. And you indicated that it was kind of a progressive thing from the fall into January of 2023, right?
Yes.
And in addition to the low mood, were you able to identify that she presented with anxiety at various points?
Yes, very much.
And did you also make observations of obsessive thinking?
Yes, obsessive thinking is a kind of anxiety where you repeatedly think about a topic, maybe that you're asking, what if, what if, what if? And it's the kind of